Tonight we prepare for Halloween. This is my library, and I am reading tonight from a book that you cannot see. That is because I am a vampire and already have committed it to memory. You can just hear the sound of flipping pages because of vampire magic, yes. Tonight I am reading from a book called Beware by R.L. Stine, the master of childhood fears, and a personal favorite of mine. In this book, he has collected short stories from various authors, including, but not limited to, himself, Ray Bradbury, and even Bram Stoker. Yes, Bram Stoker of Dracula fame. So, be my guest tonight as we delve into the darkest recesses of human imagination. We will begin tonight with a very short story written by Ray Bradbury. Called The Black Ferris. When I was 9 or 10 years old, I discovered the story. No, wait a moment. My bad. I was remembering the introduction. My bad. First, we begin with an introduction by R.L. Stine himself. When I was 9 or 10 years old, I discovered the stories of Ray Bradbury, and they changed my life. The stories were so scary, so funny, so surprising, and so beautifully written, I couldn't read enough of them. Ray Bradbury turned me into a reader. To this day, I always tell people that the creepiest book I ever read was Bradbury's book about an evil carnival. Something wicked this way comes. One day I may have to read that myself. Imagine my surprise when I found this short story, The Black Ferris. Bradbury liked it so much he later expanded it into the novel. But as you will see, the story is a chilling ride on its own. We begin. The carnival had come to town, like an October wind, like a dark bat flying over the cold lake. Bones rattling in the night, mourning, sighing, whispering up the tents in the dark rain. It stayed on the Wow, I suddenly forgot how to speak. It stayed on for a month by the gray, restless lake of October, in the black weather and increasing storms and leaden skies. Leaden. Dang. During the third week, at twilight, on a Thursday, the two small boys walked along the lake shore. In the cold wind.
"I don't believe you," said Peter.
"Come on, I'll show you," said Hank. They left wads of spit behind them all along the moist brown sand of the crashing shore. They ran to the lonely carnival grounds. It had been raining. The carnival lay by the sounding lake, with nobody buying tickets from the flaky black booths. Nobody hopping to get the salted hams from the whining roulette wheels, and none of the thin, fat freaks on the big platforms. The midway was silent, all the gray tents hissing on the wind like gigantic prehistoric wings. At 8 o'clock, perhaps, ghastly lights would flash on. Voices would shout, music would go out over the lake. Now there was only a blind hunchback sitting on a black booth, feeling of the cracked china getting tongue-twisted. Feeling of the cracked china cup from which he was drinking some perfumed brew. "There," said Hank, pointing. The black Ferris wheel rose like an immense light-bulbed constellation against the cloudy sky, silent. "I still don't believe what you said about it," said Peter. "You wait. I saw it happen. I don't know how, but it did. You know how carnivals are, all funny. Okay, this one's even funnier." Peter let himself be led to the high, green hiding place of a tree. Suddenly, Hank stiffened. Hissed. "There's Mr. Cougar, the carnival man now." Hidden, they watched. Mr. Cougar, a man of some 35 years, dressed in sharp, bright clothes, a lapel carnation, hair greased with oil, drifted under the tree, a brown derby on his head. He had arrived in town 3 weeks before, shaking his brown derby hat at people on the street from inside his shiny red Ford, tooting the horn. Now Mr. Cougar nodded at the little blind hunchback, spoke a word. The hunchback, blindly fumbling, locked Mr. Cougar into a black seat and sent him whirling up into the ominous twilight sky. Machinery hummed. "See?" whispered Hank. "The Ferris wheel's going the wrong way. Backward instead of forward." "So what?" said Peter. "Watch." The black Ferris wheel whirled 25 times around. Then the blind hunchback put out his pale hands and halted the machinery. The Ferris wheel stopped, gently swaying at a certain black seat. A 10-year-old boy stepped out. He walked off across the whispering carnival ground in the shadows. Peter almost fell from his limb. He searched the Ferris wheel with his eyes. "Where's Mr. Cougar?" Hank poked him. "You wouldn't believe me. Now see." "Where's Mr. Cougar at?" "Come on, quick, run." Hank dropped and was sprinting before he hit the ground. Under giant chestnut trees, next to I can't speak tonight. Under giant chestnut trees, next to the ravines, the lights were burning in Mrs. Foley's white mansion. Piano music tinkled. Within the warm windows, people moved. Outside, it began to rain, despondently, irrevocably, forever and ever. "I'm so wet," grieved Peter, crouching in the bushes. "Like someone squirted me with a hose. How much longer do we wait?" "Shh," said Hank, cloaked in wet mystery. They had followed the little boy from the Ferris Wheel, up through town, down dark streets to Mrs. Foley's ravine house. Now, inside the warm dining room of the house, the strange little boy sat at dinner, forking and spooning rich lamb chops and mashed potatoes. "I know his name," whispered Hank quickly. "My mom told me about him the other day. She said, 'Hank, you hear about the little orphan boy moved in Mrs. Foley's? Well, his name is Joseph Pikes, and he just came to Mrs. Foley's house one day about 2 weeks ago, and he said he was an orphan, run away, and could he have something to eat? And him and Mrs. Foley been getting on excuse me. And him and Mrs. Foley had been getting on like hot apple pie ever since. That's what my mom said," finished Hank, peering through the steamy Foley window. Water dripped from his nose. He held on to Peter, who was twitching with cold. "Pete, I didn't like his looks from the first. I didn't. He looked mean." "I'm scared," said Peter, frankly wailing. "I'm cold and hungry, and I don't know what this is all about." "Gosh, you're dumb." Hank shook his head, eyes shut in disgust. "Don't you see? 3 weeks ago, the carnival came. And about the same time, this little old orphan shows up at Mrs. Foley's. And Mrs. Foley's son died a long time ago one night, one winter, and she's never been the same. So here's this little old orphan boy who butters her all around." "Oh," said Peter, shaking. "Come on," said Hank. They marched to the front door and banged the lion knocker. Whew. After a while, the door opened and Mrs. Foley looked out. "You're all wet. Come in," she said. "My land." She herded them into the hall. "What do you want?" she said, bending over them, a tall lady with lace on her full bosom, and a pale, thin face with white hair over it. "You're Henry Walterson, aren't you?" Hank nodded, glancing fearfully at the dining room, where the strange little boy looked up from his eating. "Can we see you alone, ma'am?" And the old lady looked palely surprised. Hank crept over and shut the door and whispered at her, "We got to warn you about something. It's about that boy. Come to live with you. That orphan." The hall grew suddenly cold. Mrs. Foley drew herself high and stiff. "Well?" "He's from the carnival, and he ain't a boy. He's a man, and he's planning on living here with you until he finds where your money is, and then run off with it some night. And people will look for him, but because they'll be looking for a little 10-year-old boy, they won't recognize him when he walks by a 35-year-old man named Mr. Cougar," cried Hank. "What are you talking about?" declared Mrs. Foley. Did I say Foley, or have I been saying Foley? "The carnival, and the Ferris Wheel, and this strange man, Mr. Cougar. The Ferris Wheel going backward and making him younger. I don't know how. And him coming here as a boy, and you can't trust him. Because when he has your money, he'll get on the Ferris Wheel, and it'll go forward, and he'll be 35 years old again. And the boy will be gone forever." Excuse me, I need a drink of water. No, not water, blood. Blood, yes, blood. That is what we vampires drink. I am a vampire. That wets the works a little. Back to the story. "Good night, Henry Walterson. Don't ever come back," shouted Mrs. Foley. The door slammed. Peter and Hank found themselves in the rain once more. It soaked into them, cold and complete. "Smart guy," snorted Peter. "Now you fixed it. Suppose he heard us. Suppose he comes and kills us in our beds tonight to shut us all up for keeps." "He wouldn't do that," said Hank. "Wouldn't he?" Peter seized Hank's arm. "Look." In the big bay window of the dining room now, the mesh The mesh curtains pulled aside. Standing there in the pink light, his hand made into a menacing fist, was the little orphan boy. His face was horrible to see. The teeth bared, the eyes hateful, the lips mouthing out terrible words. That was all. The little orphan boy was there only a second, then gone. The curtain fell into place. The rain poured down upon the house. Hank and Peter walked slowly home in the storm. During supper, Father looked at Hank and said, "If you don't catch pneumonia, I'll be surprised. Soaked you were. What's with this about the carnival?" Hank fussed at his mashed potatoes, occasionally looking at the rattling windows. "You know Mr. Cougar? The carnival man, Dad?" "This one with the pink carnation in his lapel?" asked Father. "Yes." Hank sat up. You've seen him around. He stays down the street at Mrs. O'Leary's boarding house. Got a room in the back. Why? Nothing, said Hank, his face glowing. After supper, Hank pulled through a call to Peter on the phone. At the other end of the line, Peter sounded miserable with coughing. Listen, Pete, said Hank. I see it all now. When that little old orphan boy, Joseph Pikes, gets Mrs. Foley's money, he's got a good plan. What? He'll stick around town as the carnival man, living in a room at Mrs. O'Leary's. That way, nobody'll get suspicious of him. Everybody'll be looking for that nasty little boy, and he'll be gone. And he'll be walking around all disguised as the carnival man. That way, nobody'll suspect the carnival at all. It would look funny if the carnival suddenly pulled up stakes. Oh, said Peter, sniffling. So, we gotta act fast, said Hank. Nobody will believe us. I tried to tell my folks, but they said hogwash, moaned Peter. We gotta act tonight, anyway, because why? Because he's gonna try to kill us. We're the only ones that know, and if we tell the police to keep an eye on him, he's the one who stole Mrs. Foley's money and cahoots with the orphan boy. He won't live peacefully. I bet he's just tried. I bet he just tries something tonight. So I tell you, meet me at Mrs. Foley's in half an hour. Aw, said Peter. You want to die? No, thoughtfully. Well then, meet me there, and I bet we see that orphan boy sneaking out with the money tonight and running back to the carnival grounds with it, and Mrs. Foley's asleep. I'll see you there. So long, Pete. Young man, said Father, standing behind him as he hung up the phone. You're not going anywhere. You're going straight to bed here. He marched Hank upstairs. Now, hand me out everything you got on. Hank undressed. There's no other clothes in your room, are there? Asked Father. No, sir. They're all in the hall closet, said Hank. Wait, have I seen this word before? Disconsolately. Never seen that word before. Good, said Dad, and shut and locked the door. Hank stood there, naked. Holy cow, he said. Go to bed, said Father. Excuse me. Need another little sip of blood before I continue. This bottle's empty. Let me go get a fresh blood bottle real quick. some blood, with a few shots of pineapple mango for flavor. Now, back to the story. Peter arrived at Mrs. Foley's house at about 9:30, sneezing, lost in a vast raincoat and mariner's cap. He stood like a small water hydrant on the street, mourning softly over his face. The lights in Mrs. Foley's house were warmly on upstairs. Peter waited for half an hour, looking at the rain-drenched, slick streets of night. Finally, there was a darting paleness, a rustle in wet bushes. "Hank?" Peter questioned the bushes. "Yeah." Hank stepped out. "Gosh," said Peter, starting. You're naked?" "I ran all the way," said Hank. "Dad wouldn't let me out." "You'll get pneumonia," said Peter. The lights in the house went out. "Duck!" cried Hank, bounding behind some bushes. They waited. "Pete," said Hank. "You're wearing pants, aren't you?" "Sure," said Pete. "Well, you're wearing a raincoat, and nobody'll know, so lend me your pants," said Hank. A reluctant transaction was made. Hank pulled the pants on. The rain let up. The clouds began to break apart. In about 10 minutes, a small figure emerged from the house, bearing a large paper sack filled with some enormous loot or other. "There he is," whispered Hank. "There he goes," cried Peter. The orphan boy ran swiftly. "Get after him," cried Hank. Sorry, I just remembered I have, someone sleeping in the other room. Shouted a little too loudly. They gave chase through the chestnut trees, but the orphan boy was swift, up the hill, through the night streets of town, down past the rail yards, past the factories, to the midway of the deserted carnival. Hank and Peter were poor seconds. Peter weighed... Dang. Sorry, I just forgot how to read for a split second. Hank and Peter were poor seconds. Peter waited as he was with the heavy raincoat, and Hank frozen with cold. The thumping of Hank's bare feet sounded through the town. "Hurry, Pete. We can't let him get to the Ferris Wheel before we do. If he changes back into a man, we'll never prove anything." "I'm hurrying." But Pete was left behind as Hank thudded on alone in the clearing weather. "Yeah," mocked the orphan boy, darting away. No more than a shadow ahead now vanishing into the carnival yard. Hank stopped at the edge of the carnival lot. The Ferris wheel was going up and up into the sky, a big nebula of stars caught on the dark earth, turning forward and forward instead of backward. And there sat Joseph Pikes in a black-painted bucket seat, laughing up and around and down and up and around and down at little old Hank standing there. And the little blind hunchback had his hand on the roaring, oily black machine that made the Ferris wheel go up and ahead. The midway was deserted because of the rain. The merry-go-round was still, but its music played, and the crashing... but its music played and crashed in the open spaces. And Joseph Pikes rode up into the cloudy sky and came down, and each time he went around, he was a year older. His laughing changed, grew deep, his face changed, the bones of it, the mean eyes of it, the wild hair of it, sitting there in the black bucket seat, whirling swiftly, laughing into the bleak heavens, where now and again a last split of lightning showed itself. Hank ran forward, and the hunchback by the machine. On the way, he picked up a tent spike. "Here now!" yelled the hunchback. The black Ferris wheel whirled around. "You!" stormed the hunchback, fumbling out. Hank hit him in the kneecap and danced away. "Ouch!" screamed the man, falling forward. He tried to reach the machine brake to stop the Ferris wheel. When he put out his hand on the brake, Hank ran in and slammed the tent spike against his fingers, mashing them. He hit them twice. The man held his hand in his other hand, howling. He kicked at Hank. Hank grabbed the foot, pulled the man, slipping on the mud, and fell. Hank hit him on the head, shouting. The Ferris wheel went around and around and around. "Stop the wheel!" cried Joseph Pikes, Mr. Cougar, flung up in a stormy, cold sky, in the bubbled constellation of whirl and rush and wind. "I can't move," groaned the hunchback. Hank jumped on his chest, and they thrashed, biting, kicking. "Stop! Stop the wheel!" cried Mr. Cougar, a man, a different man, and his voice this time, coming around in panic, going up into the roaring, hissing sky of the Ferris wheel. The wind blew through the high, dark wheel spokes. "Stop! Stop! Oh, please stop the wheel!" Hank leaped up from the sprawled hunchback. He started on the brake mechanism, hitting it, jamming it, putting chunks of metal in it, tying it with rope, and again hitting at the crawling, weeping dwarf. "Stop! Stop! Stop the wheel!" wailed a voice high in the night, where the windy moon was coming out of the vaporous white clouds. "Stop!" The voice faded. Now the carnival was ablaze with sudden light. Men sprang out of tents, came running. Hank felt himself jerked into the air, with oaths and beatings rained on him. From a distance, there was a sound of Peter's voice, and behind Peter, a full tilt. A police officer with pistol drawn. "Stop! Stop the wheel!" In the wind, the voice sighed away. The voice repeated and repeated. The dark carnival men tried to apply the brake. Nothing happened. The machine hummed and turned the wheel around and around. The mechanism was jammed. "Stop!" cried the voice one last time. Silence. Without a word, the Ferris wheel flew in a circle, a high system of electric stars and metal and seats. There was no sound now, but the sound of the motor, which died and stopped. The Ferris wheel coasted for a minute. All the carnival people looking up at it. The policeman looking up at it. Hank and Peter looking up at it. The Ferris wheel stopped. A crowd had gathered at the noise. A few fishermen from the wharf house. A few switchmen from the rail yards. The Ferris wheel stood whining and stretching in the wind. "Look," everybody said. The policemen turned around, and the carnival people turned, and the fishermen turned, and they all looked at the occupant in the black painted seat at the bottom of the ride. The wind touched and moved the black wooden seat in a gentle rocking rhythm, crooning over the occupant in the dim carnival light. A skeleton sat there, a paper bag of money in its hands, and a brown derby hat on its head. The end. So, that was The Black Ferris by Ray Bradbury. Next up, I will read, and let's see. The Judge's House. Written by Bram Stoker. Retold by R.L. Stine. So, my thoughts on The Black Ferris. Well, I think it's fine. A fine little spooky story by Ray Bradbury. Clearly a bit of an older American Southern style to it. This is the story that would eventually be expanded upon by Bradbury to become his novel Something Wicked This Way Comes, which Disney eventually made a movie out of. I hope you enjoyed that story. So, next up, we have The Judge's House. I'll start with the introduction by R.L. Stine. You may not know the name. You may not know the name Bram Stoker, but you probably will recognize the name of his most famous creation, Dracula. Stoker's Dracula was published over 100 years ago, in 1897. Thanks to Stoker, we all know the chill of flapping bat wings and the horror of vampire fangs seeking fresh blood. Collecting stories from his book, I remembered a Bram Stoker story called The Judge's House. It too was written over 100 years ago, in a time of horse-drawn carriages and kerosene lamps. Much of the language was old-fashioned and hard to follow, but the story was still scary, so I decided to write my own version, which would be easier for all of us to read and enjoy. Sorry, no vampires in this story, except for me. But I recommend you read it with the lights on, especially if you're afraid of rats. Malcolm was a serious young man, tall and bone-thin. He had long, unbrushed brown hair and small, dark brown eyes that always seemed to be squinting because of all the books he read. One night, his friends found Malcolm packing his suitcase. "My college examination is coming up in 3 months," he explained. "I want to go somewhere far away, somewhere quiet where I can study in peace." His friends didn't argue with him. They knew how serious Malcolm was about his studies. Malcolm packed up all the books he needed. Then he took a train to a tiny town far away from his home. He found a quaint inn across from the train station. Mrs. Whitham, the owner, showed him to a small closet of a room. She was a round, red-faced woman with curly gray hair. She wore a stained white apron over her long, pleated gray dress. "Have you come to stay for long, young mister?" she asked. "I need to find a house," Malcolm replied. "A quiet house where I can study without being disturbed." "This is a quiet town," Mrs. Whitham said. "I am sure you will be happy here." A short while later, Malcolm set out on his search for a place to live. At the edge of town, he discovered an old rambling house, dark and empty and surrounded by a high brick wall. Malcolm stared at its dust-covered windows, tiny and high above the street. Even though the sun shone brightly, the house was cloaked in shade. "It looks more like a fort than a house," Malcolm thought. "I wonder why no one lives here." He felt a chill. It was as if the sunlight did not dare touch the house. "This is the place I'm looking for," Malcolm decided. "No one will bother me here. I can study in complete quiet." He found the man in charge of the property, who was very happy to rent the house to him. "I am glad to see someone live in the old house," the man told Malcolm. "It has been empty for so long because of the rumors." "Rumors?" Malcolm asked. "Never mind," the man said. He pushed a pen into Malcolm's hand. "Sign here on this line." Malcolm paid 3 months' rent. Then he returned to the inn to pick up his belongings. "I have rented the old house on the edge of town," he told Mrs. Whitham. She let out a horrified cry. "Not the judge's house?" Mrs. Whitham turned pale. "Who is the judge?" Malcolm asked. "He lived there 100 years ago," the woman explained, trembling. "He was hated by all. He gave the harshest sentences of any judge. No one went free from his courtroom. All who came before him ended in prison forever or faced the hanging rope." "But what's wrong with his house?" Malcolm asked. Mrs. Whitham shuddered. "I have heard the rumors, sir," she said. "Frightening rumors. There's something about that house. If you were my boy, you wouldn't sleep there at night. Not if I had to go there myself and pull the big alarm bell that's on the roof." Malcolm laughed. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I'll be studying so hard I doubt I'll notice any mysterious somethings." Exploring the enormous old house, Malcolm trudged through a carpet of dust on the floors. The rooms were bare and dark. The tiny windows near the ceilings didn't let in much light. He wandered through the maze of long, twisting hallways until he came to the dining room. He gazed at the oak table in the center of the room, the broad stone fireplace on one wall, the dark paintings that covered the walls. "This room is much bigger than my apartment back home. It is certainly big enough for all my needs," Malcolm thought. "I'll make it cozy and warm, and we'll live in this room." To his surprise, he found Mrs. Whitham outside. She had brought several men and boys with her. They carried chairs, a new bed, and other items he would need. Mrs. Whitham looked around the big dining room and shivered. "Perhaps, sir, since the room is big and drafty, you might put a tall wooden screen around your bed at night?" Malcolm laughed. "And what will a screen keep out?" "Rats and mice and beetles," Mrs. Whitham replied. "Do you think that these old walls are not home to many rats, sir?" "I am not afraid of a few rats," Malcolm said. "I'll be studying so hard I won't even hear them." If only he had listened to the kind woman's warnings. Excuse me. Later that day, Malcolm hired an old woman named Mrs. Dempster to look after him. Then he took a long walk, studying a book as he strolled. When he returned in the evening, he found the room swept and tidied, a fire burning in the hearth, the lamp lit. The table was spread for supper, with Mrs. Dempster's excellent food. "This is a comfort, indeed," Malcolm said, rubbing his hands in the fire's warmth. After eating his fill, Malcolm moved the food away and placed his books on the table. Listening to the pleasant crackle of the fire, he began to study. Malcolm read for several hours until his eyes grew tired. He shut them for a moment, but opened them quickly. What is that sound? Not the crackle of the fire, but a scraping, crawling sound, as if something were scratching to get into the room. No, wait. He heard hard thumps, more scratching. At the ceiling? Under the floor? From behind the big painting on the walls? He held his breath and listened. Scratch, scratch. Thump, thump, thump. Mrs. Whittem was right. The house was filled with rats. Dozens of them? Hundreds, perhaps? Malcolm could hear them, above the ceiling and under the floor, and behind the paintings on the walls, racing and gnawing and scratching. Malcolm swallowed hard. He took a deep breath. Then he clapped his hands over his ears and bent over his book. Shut them out, he muttered. He tried to return to his studies, but the scratching sounds echoed in his ears. He took his lamp and walked around the big room, exploring. He could hear the rats scampering everywhere, but they stayed out of sight. He stopped to gaze at the old pictures that covered the walls. They were coated so thickly with dust and dirt, he couldn't make out any details. He stepped closer to the wall of paintings, then froze in fear. His hands began to tremble, and he almost dropped the lamp. The walls were filled with cracks and holes, and from every crack and hole, eyes stared out at him. Hundreds of rats' eyes, bright eyes glittering in the lamplight. Bright, shiny eyes staring at him from all around the room. Keep calm, Malcolm told himself. Keep calm. They will not attack. They are too frightened to come out in the open. He crossed the room and gazed at the rope of the great alarm on the roof. It hung down into the room on the right side of the fireplace. Malcolm returned to the table. He forced himself to study again. For a while, the rats disturbed him with their racing and scratching, but soon he became so drawn into his book, he didn't hear the sounds. Late at night, he finally looked up from his reading. The fire had fallen low, but still threw out a deep red glow. The room was strangely quiet. As Malcolm's gaze wandered, he gasped. On the back of the tall oak chair by the fireplace stood a creature. An enormous rat. It glared at him with red, angry eyes. "It's as big as a cat!" Malcolm's heart began to pound. What has it been feeding on to make it grow so big? He stared back at the rat, stared at the creature's glowing eyes. Human eyes, he thought, not the eyes of a rodent. "Go!" Malcolm screamed at the top of his voice. "Go away!" The fat rodent didn't budge. "Oh, excuse me?" "Excuse me." Malcolm swung his arm hard at the creature, as if batting it away. Then he pretended to throw something at it. Again, the rat didn't stir, but it hissed and showed its sharp, white teeth. Malcolm jumped up from the table. He grabbed the fireplace poker and ran at the rat. The rat let out another angry hiss. Then it leaped from the chair, darted across the floor, and raced up the rope of the bell alarm. In seconds, it disappeared into the darkness above. Breathing hard, Malcolm stood with the poker in his hand, staring up at the dark, empty ceiling. Weariness swept over him. "I must get some sleep," he thought. "Plenty of time to worry about the rats tomorrow." The next morning, Malcolm felt tired after his long night of studying, but a strong cup of tea helped him to wake up. He found a quiet path between high elm trees that led out of town. He walked most of the day, reading his book along the way. When he returned to town, he ran into Mrs. Whitham, the innkeeper. "You must not overdo it, sir," she scolded. "You are paler this morning than you ought to be. Tell me, how did your first night go?" "Not bad," Malcolm replied, "except for the rats." "You were right, Mrs. Whitham. The house is infested with them. There was one wicked-looking old devil that sat out in my chair by the fire. He wouldn't go until I took a fire poker to him." "Mercy on us!" Mrs. Whitham exclaimed. "An old devil sitting on the chair by the fireplace. Take care, sir, take care." That night, the scampering of the rats began earlier. They scurried up and down, under and over. They squeaked and scratched and gnawed. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat as they poked their heads out of the chinks and cracks in the walls. Their eyes shone like tiny lamps as the firelight rose and fell. They sprang out from the holes. They climbed on to the tops of the big paintings. Then, snapping their tails, they formed a circle around the room. Malcolm felt chill after chill run down his back. They are getting closer, he thought. They are getting braver. He banged the table with his fist, trying to scare them away. He tried to concentrate on his studies. He covered his ears with his hands as he leaned over his book. All at once, the rat stopped. Malcolm sat up, alert and surprised. Silence, the silence of the grave, he thought. The rats had all vanished. What made them disperse? He raised his eyes to the chair by the fire and gasped. There, on the high-backed chair, sat the enormous rat. Once again, the rat glared at him. Coldly, with blood-red eyes. The others disappear when this rat arrives, Malcolm thought. Are they frightened of it? The huge rat bared its teeth and hissed at Malcolm. Malcolm picked up his heavy textbook and flung it at the fat gray creature. His aim was poor. The book hit the wall and dropped to the floor. The rat didn't stir. With an angry cry, Malcolm raced across the room, grabbed the fireplace poker, and came at the rat, swinging the poker in front of him. Once again, the rat uttered an angry hiss. Its red eyes burned with hatred. Malcolm swung the heavy poker. The rat dropped heavily off the chair. It scampered up the alarm bell rope and pulled itself out of sight. Where does it go up there? Malcolm wondered. Is there a hole in the ceiling where it escapes? Malcolm couldn't see that high. His kerosene lamp was too dim, and the fire had burned low. Malcolm stared at the large paintings high on the wall. He couldn't see them either. I must have cleaned them, he decided. And I must burn more lamps in this room. He pulled his watch from his trouser pocket. Nearly midnight. He threw some logs on the fire, then made a pot of tea. While he sipped his tea, he thought about the giant rat. He shuddered. That rat was too bold, he thought. Is it challenging me by sitting up like a human in the chair? Is it planning to attack? If I could find out where it escapes, perhaps I could set a trap for it. Once again, the rat began to scamper, above his head and beneath the floor. Malcolm searched the house until he found another lamp. He lit it and placed it on the fireplace mantel. That's better, he thought. I can see a little better. He returned to the table and piled up all of the books he had brought with him. I want them handy so I can throw them at the ugly creature, he thought. Then Malcolm lifted the rope of the alarm bell and placed the end of it on the table. He tucked the end under the burning table lamp. There now, my friend, said Malcolm. If you start to climb down the rope, the lamp will shake. I will know you are coming, and I will be ready for you. The rats crawled and scratched the walls. Malcolm couldn't see them, but he could hear them chewing. Hear the thud of their feet over his head. Hear the scrape and slap of their tails over the wood. "Go away! Go away!" he wailed. But the rats ignored his shouts and continued their ugly noises. Clamping his hands over his ears, Malcolm returned to his studies. He worked long into the night, until he realized the house had grown silent again. A deep silence. The only sound Malcolm could hear was the beating of his heart. And then the rope jiggled. The lamp moved. Malcolm looked up in time to see the enormous rat dropped from the rope onto the armchair. It sat there, glaring at him. Malcolm raised his book and took careful aim. He flung it at the rat. The rat sprang aside. The book flew past it. Malcolm grabbed another book, and another, and another. He threw them at the rat, but the big creature dodged each one. Breathing hard, Malcolm grabbed one last book. He raised it high and aimed. To his surprise, the rat squeaked and whimpered and seemed afraid. Malcolm heaved the book, and it struck the rat. "Eee!" The rat uttered a horrifying shriek. It made a great jump for the rope and pulled itself up as fast as it could. By the light of the new lamp, Malcolm could see where the rat had escaped. It leapt to a molding on the wall, then disappeared through a hole in one of the large, dust-covered paintings. "The third painting from the fireplace," Malcolm said. "I shall not forget. Tomorrow, I shall find my fat friend's home and set a trap up there. That rat shall pay me no more visits." Malcolm bent to pick up the book that had hit the rat and let out a gasp. "The Bible my mother gave me. What an odd coincidence." Excuse me, my mouth is getting a little dry. The next morning, Malcolm gave Mrs. Dempster special instructions. "Please, find a ladder and wash those paintings, especially the third one from the fireplace. I want to see what they are." Malcolm studied his books all day in the shaded walk outside of town. In the afternoon, he paid a visit to Mrs. Whitham at her inn. She introduced him to a man named Dr. Thornhill. "Mrs. Whitham asked me to speak to you," the doctor said. As a white-haired man with a short, snowy beard, he had a round, red face and a bulging stomach under his black suit jacket. "She doesn't like the idea of your being in that house by yourself." "I am not afraid of the house," Malcolm replied, "but I am having a problem with the rats. One big creature in particular." He told Dr. Thornhill about his adventures with the giant rat. Mrs. Whitten sighed and shook her head. Dr. Thornhill's face grew grim. "That rat always disappears. Up the rope of the alarm bell?" he asked. "Always," Malcolm replied. The doctor rubbed his beard, and he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I suppose you know what the rope is?" Malcolm shook his head no. "It's the hanging rope that the judge used on his victims," Dr. Thornhill said. "Excuse me. I'm gonna need to use the little vampire's room for just a moment, if that's all right. It'll be just a mere moment." "My apologies. O negative just runs straight through me. Now, back to the story. Malcolm thought about the doctor's words as he walked home. He seemed like a kindly man, Malcolm thought. Why did he tell me about that rope? Was he trying to frighten me or help me? Dr. Thornhill had given Malcolm instructions. If you have any kind of fright tonight, ring the alarm bell. If I hear the bell, I will hurry to your rescue. Rescue? Malcolm thought. Why would I need to be rescued? Malcolm returned home to find the place bright and tidy, with a cheerful fire and the lamps glowing. The night was cold for April. A heavy wind blew. Raindrops began to patter against the windows. Malcolm ate his dinner and settled down to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Once again, he heard the claw and scrape of the rats. Even over the sounds of the storm, a million tiny eyes peered out at him from every crack and hole in the wall. Why are you watching me? Malcolm wondered. Are you expecting something to happen tonight? The rope suddenly rose and fell. Malcolm uttered a cry. Then he realized it was caused by the storm winds blowing hard against the alarm bell on the roof. It is the hanging rope that the judge used on his victims. Dr. Thornhill's solemn words came back to Malcolm. Malcolm felt a shiver roll down the back of his neck. Lifting the lamp, he crossed the room to the paintings on the wall. They had been dusted and washed. Now he could see them clearly. He raised the lamp to the third painting from the fire and felt another shiver. It was of a judge, dressed in a scarlet robe. The face was strong and evil, with a beetle-like nose, and cold. Did I say beetle-like? With a beak-like nose and cold, glowing eyes. The eyes. Malcolm stared at the judge's face with growing horror. The eyes. No, it cannot be, Malcolm cried. The eyes. They were the same as the rat's eyes. Malcolm's heart began to thud in his chest. He suddenly felt cold all over. He gazed hard at the painting. The judge was seated in a high... Sorry, I just lost my train of thought reading that sentence. The judge was seated high... Wait. Sorry. The judge was seated in a high-backed oak chair. The chair stood to the right of a wide stone fireplace. Behind it, a rope hung down from the ceiling. It is this rope, Malcolm whispered. It is this room in the painting. His whole body shook. He spun around, and a cry escaped his throat. There, in the judge's chair, with the rope hanging behind, sat the rat. It stared hard at Malcolm with cold, dark eyes. The same eyes as the judge in the painting. The lamp fell from Michael. The lamp fell from The lamp fell from Malcolm's hand. Oil spilled over the floor. His body trembling, He bent to pick up the lamp. You see, these are the things that they edit out of audiobooks, so you can't hear the narrator flub up every once in a while. Not really a thing you can do doing it live. When he turned back to the chair, the rat was gone. The rope swayed. Malcolm saw the big rat scurrying up the rope. Then halfway up the rope, it stopped. It lowered its head and furiously began to gnaw. What is it doing? Malcolm wondered. Why is it chewing at the rope? Outside, the wind howled. Waves of rain battered the windows. Malcolm stared up helplessly as the rat chewed through the rope. After a few seconds, a long section of rope fell to the floor in front of the chair. The rat clung to the remaining rope. Excuse me. Throat's getting a little dry once again. Dr. Thornhill's words came back to him. If you have any kind of fright tonight, ring the alarm bell. I will hurry to your rescue. But I can't reach it now, Malcolm realized. Now I can't pull the rope to call for help. And then Malcolm let out a shrill cry of horror as his eyes returned to the third painting on the wall. How could that be? How? A wide brown patch filled the center of the painting. The judge had disappeared from the painting. Malcolm spun around, and in a chill of horror, he saw the judge in his scarlet robe, sitting on the oak chair. He wore a cold smile of triumph on his face, and his smile grew wider. The clock began to chime. Midnight. Slowly, the judge rose from the chair. As Malcolm stared in fright, the judge picked up the piece of rope. He drew it through his hands, smiling all the while. Then he began to knot one end of it, tying it into a noose. I just combine nose and noose. My bad. Holding the rope in both hands, the judge moved in front of the door. I'm trapped, Malcolm realized. He has me trapped here. The judge moved closer. Staying between Malcolm and the door, he raised the noose and threw it at Malcolm. Malcolm tried to dodge away, but his legs were trembling too hard to move. The loop of the rope narrowly missed him. His eyes glowing, the judge raised the noose again and tossed it at Malcolm. Malcolm uttered a faint cry. Another near miss. Malcolm's heart pounded. He searched the room, frantically looking for a way to escape. To his horror, the rats began to come out of their holes. Hundreds of them huddled around the walls, red eyes glowing, snapping their jaws, whipping their tails, chittering and shrieking. They moved in, tightening their circle. More rats poured out from behind the painting. They swarmed over the mantel, over the table. Rats covered every surface. Glancing up, Malcolm saw the rope to the alarm bell covered with rats, every inch. And still more rats poured out from the ceiling onto the rope. The rope grew heavier, heavier, and the bell began to ring. Yes, Malcolm thought, the rats are ringing the alarm. The bell rang louder and louder. Yes, Malcolm thought, ring the alarm to bring help. The bell clanged. The rats began to squeal. The wind howled. The judge stepped up and lowered the rope around Malcolm's neck. The people of the village heard the clang of the alarm bell, and a crowd began running through the storm with lamps and torches. Dr. Thornhill was the first to arrive. He pounded on the door, but there was no reply. "Break the door! Hurry!" he boomed. The men used a wide tree branch to break it down. Dr. Thornhill rushed into the dining room. The villagers followed close behind him. "No!" he groaned as he saw Malcolm's body swinging from the end of the alarm bell rope. And then he turned in horror and saw the face of the judge in the painting. The judge's face with its broad, triumphant smile. The end. And that was Bram Stoker's The Judge's House, rewritten by R.L. Stine. Let me check the index again to choose our next story. Let me know your thoughts on each story if you have any. Alright, let's see. There are so many. let's read Herald by Alvin Schwartz. Page 179. This is a nice, short one. So, oh, excuse me. Excuse me. Vampires are very susceptible to sneezing from dust. I don't know if you knew that, but now you do. Little introduction by R.L. Stine. Alvin Schwartz collected scary stories and folk tales for many years. I love his books because you can always pick one up, open it anywhere, read a short story or two, and give yourself a chill. Some of the stories Alvin Schwartz collected have been frightening people for centuries, and they are just as scary now as the day they were first told. Here are two of my favorites. If you have ever dared anyone to do something dangerous, you will enjoy The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. And if scarecrows give you the creeps, don't read Herald late at night or during the day either. Herald, Retold by Alvin Schwartz. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool, green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months. Then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, it was boring. All day the two men tended their cows. At night they went back to the tiny hut they lived in. They ate supper, and worked in the garden, and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It would be fun to make, and we could put it out in the garden to scare away them birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They both would laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him or punch him. Sometimes, one of them would take the food they were eating, which they were both sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you'd better eat it, or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas, "and that will be that. "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So, they left Harold sitting in a corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or make him go... Apologies, excuse me. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the doll grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse, or some insects had gotten inside Harold and were making those sounds. So, Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We've been up here on this mountain too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. After all, what could a doll do? They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked on toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. The end. I'm pretty sure that is a story from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, recollected here for R.L. Stine's Beware. Let me see something about the stream real quick. Oh dear. You can really hear my computer fans working really hard to make this stream work. Oh my goodness. Why are those fans so loud? I'm just reading a book. The computer doesn't have to work that hard. Anyway, I'll find our next story. Let's continue with Alvin Schwartz with The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. It's another short one. Then we'll finish off the night with The Witches by Roald Dahl, who, if I'm not mistaken, is the same person who wrote the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory book, the original book that both movies are based on. I'm not sure if that's the same story that the movie The Witches is based on. Perhaps it is. Though I've only seen the original movie. I haven't seen the Anne Hathaway remake yet. The Girl Who Stood on a Grave, retold by Alvin Schwartz. Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. Don't ever stand on a grave after dark, one of the boys said. The person inside will grab you. He'll pull you under. That's not true, one of the girls said. "It's just a superstition." "I'll give you $1 if you stand on a grave," said the boy. "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl. "I'll do it right now." The boy handed her his knife. "Stick this knife in one of the graves," he said. "Then we'll know you were there." The graveyard was filled with shadows and was as quiet as death. "There's nothing to be scared of," the girl told herself, but she was scared anyway. She picked out a grave and stood on it. Then, quickly, she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil. And she started to leave, but she couldn't get away. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time to leave, but she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. "Something has got me," she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife into her skirt and had pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that held her. She had died of fright. The end. A silly little story on first reading. Though I guess it means she had a panic attack and died of a panic attack. Okay, let's see. Where are the witches? This one's a little bit longer than that. Page 101. An introduction by R.L. Stine. You are trapped in a room filled with 200 witches. Witches who remove their faces to reveal their shrunken, shriveled, crumpled, rotting faces beneath. Witches who are dedicated to cruelty for children. Frightening? Funny? Time to open your mouth and scream? Yes. People of all ages love Roald Dahl's delightfully devilish creations. I read his adult stories before I discovered his children's books, and I loved them. Dahl has such a wicked view of the world. In his stories, quiet, normal people often turn out to be evil in the most surprising ways. But I like his children's stories even better. Here is one of my favorite, frightful scenes from The Witches. Watch out! The Grand High Witch is about to enter now. Wait a moment. This isn't the full story, it's just an excerpt. Oh well, hopefully it will serve on its own. The Witches by Roald Dahl. Now that the manager had gone, I was not particularly alarmed. What better than to be imprisoned in a room full of these splendid ladies? If I ever got talking to them, I might even suggest that they come and do a bit of cruelty to children preventing at my school. We could certainly use them there. In they came, talking their heads off as women always do when you get a whole bunch of them together. That's Roald Dahl speaking, not me. Or at least it's the character speaking. They began milling around and choosing their seats, and there was a whole lot of stuff like, "Come and sit next to me, Middly dear," and "Oh, hello, Beatrice. I haven't seen you since the last meeting. What an adorable dress you have on." I decided to stay where I was and let them get on with their meeting while I got on with my mouse training. But I watched them for a while longer through the crack in the screen, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I guessed about 200. The back rows filled up first. They all seemed to want to sit as far back from the platform as possible. Excuse me, my mouth is getting a little dry. In the middle of the back row, there was a lady wearing a tiny green hat who kept scratching the nape of her neck. She couldn't leave it alone. It fascinated me the way her fingers kept scratching away at the hair on the back of her neck. Had she known somebody was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wondered if she had dandruff. All of a sudden, I noticed that the lady next to her was doing the same thing. And the next one. And the next. The whole lot of them were doing it. They were all scratching away like mad at the hair on the backs of their necks. Do they have fleas in their hair? More likely it was nits. A boy at school called Ashton had nits in his hair last term, and the matron had made him dip his whole head in turpentine. It killed the nits all right, but it nearly killed Ashton as well. Half the skin came away on his scalp. Jeez. I began to be fascinated by these hair-scratching ladies. It is always funny when you catch someone doing something coarse, and she thinks no one is looking. Nose picking, for example, or scratching her bottom. Hair scratching is very nearly as unattractive, especially if it goes on and on. I decided it had to be nits. Then, the most astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingers up underneath her hair on her head. And the hair, the entire head of hair, lifted upward, all in one piece. And the hand slid underneath the hair and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. She was also wearing gloves. I glanced swiftly around at the rest of the now seated audience. Every one of them was wearing gloves. My blood turned to ice. I began to shake all over. I glanced frantically behind me for a back door to escape through. There wasn't one. Should I leap out from behind the screen and make a dash for the double doors? Those double doors were already closed, and I could see a woman standing in front of them. She was bending forward and fixing some sort of a metal chain around the door handles. Keep still, I told myself. No one has seen you yet. There's no reason in the world why they should come and look behind the screen. But one false move, one cough, one sneeze, one blow, one little sound of any sort, and it won't just be one witch that gets you. It'll be 200. At that point, I think I fainted. The whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with. But I don't believe I was out for more than a few seconds. And when I came to, I was laying on the carpet, and I was still, thank heavens, behind the screen. There was absolute silence all around me. Rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered once again through the cracks in the screen. All the women, or rather witches, were now sitting motionless in their chairs and staring as though hypnotized at somebody who had suddenly appeared on the platform. That somebody was another woman. The thing I noticed about this woman was her size. She was tiny, probably no more than 4.5 feet tall. She looked quite young. I guessed about 25 or 6. And she was very pretty. She had on a rather stylish black dress that reached almost to the ground, and she wore black gloves that came up to her elbows. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing a hat. She didn't look to me like a witch at all. But she couldn't possibly not be one. Otherwise, what on earth was she doing up there on the platform? And why, for heaven's sake, were all the other witches gazing at her with such a mixture of adoration, awe, and fear? Very slowly, the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her gloved fingers unhooking something behind her ears. And then she caught hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean away. The whole of that pretty face came away in her hands. It was a mask. As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully upon a small nearby table. And when she turned around and faced us, I nearly screamed out loud. That face of hers was the most frightful and frightening thing I have ever seen. Just looking at it gave me the shakes all over. It was so crumpled and wizened and shrunken and shriveled, it looked as though it had been pickled in vinegar. It was a fearsome and ghastly sight. There was something terribly wrong with it, something foul and putrid and decayed. It seemed quite literally to be rotting away at the edges. In the middle of her face, all around her mouth and cheeks, I could see the skin, all cankered and worm-eaten, as though maggots were working away in there. There were times when something is so frightful, you become mesmerized by it and can't look away. I was like that now. I was transfixed. I was numbed. I was magnetized by the sheer horror of this woman's features. But there was more to it than that. There was a look of serpents in those eyes of hers as they flashed around the audience. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than the Grand High Witch herself. I also knew why she had worn a mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone book in at a hotel with her real face. Everyone who saw her would have run away screaming. "The doors!" shouted the Grand High Witch in a voice that filled the room and bounced around the walls. "Are they chained and bolted?" "The doors are chained and bolted, your grandness," answered a voice in the audience. The brilliant snake's eyes that were set so deep in that dreadful, rotting, worm-eaten face glared unblinkingly at the witches who sat facing her. "You may remove your gloves," she shouted. Her voice, I noticed, had the same metallic quality as the voice of the witch I had met under the conker tree. Only it was far louder and much harsher. It rasped, it grated, it snarled, it scraped, it shrieked, and it growled. Everyone in the room was peeling off their gloves. I was watching the hands of those in the back row, and I wanted very much to see what their fingers looked like, and whether my grandmother had been right. Ah, yes, I could see several of them now. I could see the brown claws curling over the tips of the fingers. They were about 2 inches long, those claws, and sharp at the ends. "You may remove your shoes," barked the Grand High Witch. I heard a sigh of relief going up from all the witches in the room as they kicked off their narrow, high-heeled shoes, and then got a glimpse under the chairs of several pairs of stockinged feet. Square and completely toeless, revolting they were, as though the toes had been sliced away from the feet with a carving knife. "You may remove your wigs," snarled the Grand High Witch. She had a peculiar way of speaking. There were some sort of foreign accent there. Something harsh and guttural, and she seemed to have trouble pronouncing the letter W. As well as that, she did something funny with the letter R. she would roll it around and round her mouth like a piece of hot pork crackling before spitting it out. "Remove your wigs and get some fresh air into your spotty scalps," she shouted, and another sigh of relief arose from the audience as all the hands went up to the heads and all the wigs, with the hats still on them, were lifted away. There now appeared in front of me, row upon row of bald female heads, a sea of naked scalps. Every one of them red and itchy looking from behind, rubbed by the linings of their wigs. I simply cannot tell you how awful they were. And somehow, the whole sight was made more grotesque, because underneath those frightful, scabby bald heads, the bodies were dressed in fashionable and rather pretty clothes. It was monstrous. It was unnatural. Oh heavens, I thought. Oh help! Oh my, have mercy on me. These foul, bald-headed females are child killers. Every one of them. And here I am imprisoned in the same room, and I can't escape. At that point, a new and doubly horrifying thought struck me. My grandmother had said that their special nose holes, they could smell out a child on a pitch-black night from right across the other side of the road. Up to now, my grandmother had been right every time. It seemed a certainty before that one of the witches in the back row was going to sniff me out at any moment. And then the yell of "Dogs droppings" would go up all over the room, and I would be cornered like a rat. I knelt on the carpet behind the screen, hardly daring to breathe. Then, suddenly, I remembered another very important thing my grandmother had told me. "The dirtier you are," she had said, "the harder it is for a witch to smell you out." How long since I had last had a bath? Not for ages. I had my own room in the hotel, and my grandmother never bothered with silly things like that. Come to think of it, I don't believe I'd had a bath since we arrived. When I had last washed my hands or face. Certainly not this morning. Not yesterday either. I glanced down at my hands. They were covered with smudge and mud, and goodness knows what else besides. So perhaps I had a chance after all. The stink waves couldn't possibly get out through all that dirt. "Witches of England!" shouted the Grand High Witch. She herself, I noticed, had not taken off either her wigs or her gloves or her shoes. "Witches of England!" she yelled. The audience stirred uneasily and sat up straight in their chairs. "Miserable witches!" she yelled. "Useless, lazy witches! Feeble, fribbling witches! You are a heap of idle, good-for-nothing worms!" A shudder went through the audience. The Grand High Witch was clearly in an ugly mood, and they knew it. I had a feeling that something awful was going to happen soon. "I am having my breakfast this morning," cried the Grand High Witch, "and I am looking out of the window at the beach, and what am I seeing? I am asking you, what am I seeing? I am seeing a revolting sight. I am seeing hundreds, and I am seeing thousands of rotten, repulsive little children playing on the sand. It is putting me right off my food. Why have you not gotten rid of them?" she screamed. "Why have you not rubbed them all out? These filthy, smelly children." Each word she spoke flecked a pale blue phlegm snot from her mouth like little bullets. "I am asking you why," she screamed. Nobody answered her question. "Children smell," she screamed. "They stink out the world. We do not want these children around here." The bald heads in the audience all nodded vigorously. "One child a week is good to me." The Grand High Witch cried out. "No, wait. One child a week is no good to me." The Grand High Witch cried out. "Is that the best you can do?" "We will do better," murmured the audience. "We will do much better." "Better is no good either," shrieked the Grand High Witch. "I demand maximum results. There are so many orders." No, wait a minute. I just said that completely wrong. "So, here are my orders. I order that every single child in this country be rubbed out, squashed, squirted, and frighted before I come across here again. In 1 year's time, do I make myself clear?" A great gasp went out from the audience. I saw the witches all looking at one another with deeply troubled expressions, and I heard one witch at the end of the front row saying aloud, "All of them? We can't possibly wipe out all of them." The Grand High Witch whipped out around as though someone had struck a skewer into her bottom. "Who said that?" she snapped. "Who dares argue with me? It was you, was it not?" She pointed a gloved finger as sharp as a needle at the witch who had spoken. "I didn't mean it, your grandness," the witch cried out. "I didn't mean to argue. I was just talking to myself." "You dared to argue with me," screamed the Grand High Witch. "I was just talking to myself," cried the wretched witch. "I swear it, your grandness." She began to shake with fear. The Grand High Witch took a step forward. and when she spoke again, it was in a voice that made my blood run cold. A stupid witch who answers back must burn until her bones are black, she screamed. No, no, begged the witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch went on. A foolish witch without a brain must sizzle in the fiery flame. Save me, cried the wretched witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch took no notice of her. She spoke again. An idiotic witch like you must roast upon the barbecue. Forgive me, oh, your grandness, cried the miserable culprit. I didn't mean it. But the Grand High Witch continued with her terrible recital. A witch who dares to say I'm wrong, vile, not be vicious, very long. A moment later, a stream of sparks that looked like tiny white hot metal fillings came shooting out of the Grand High Witch's eyes and flew straight towards the one who had dared to speak. I saw sparks striking against her and burrowing into her, and she screamed a horrible howl. Ah! Scream, and a puff of smoke rose up around her. A scream, a smell of burning meat filled the room. Nobody moved. Like me, they were all watching the smoke. And when it had cleared away, and the chair was empty, I caught a glimpse of something wispy white and a little cloud fluttering upwards and disappearing out from the window. A great sigh rose from the audience. The Grand High Witch declared and glared around the room. I hope that nobody else is going to cross me today, she remarked. There was a deathly silence. Frizzled like a flitter, said the Grand High Witch, cooked like a carrot. You will never see her again. Now, we can get down to business. And that is the end of the excerpt from Roald from Roald Dahl's The Witches. And yes, it was the one the movies are based on. I was right. You should watch it as a kind of family Halloween movie. And with that, I will end tonight's stream. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed these spooky stories. And I hope my computer's fan wasn't too loud. Now then, I have some very important vampire business to attend to before the sun arises. So, I bid you adieu.